This week, in response to the threat of rising inflation, especially in the services sector, the Reserve Bank shocked markets by raising its cash rate by 0.25%. The Federal Reserve and European Central Bank, well, they did the same thing. Let's go to this fight against inflation here and around the world and its consequences with Stephen Miller, the advisor to GSFM. Always good to have you on the program, Stephen.
Thanks, Ross.
And this has been an important week because the Reserve Bank surprises markets. The Federal Reserve doesn't surprise markets. Maybe the European Central Bank surprises a little bit by only having a 0.25% rate rise. But the fight against inflation continues.
The fight against inflation does continue. And I think, as you said in your introductory remarks, we've sort of seen inflation peak probably in most of those jurisdictions that raised rates this week. The problem is the progress going down toward target, it looks as though it's only very, very grudging. And the issue is services inflation.
Here, that services inflation at more than 6.1% and rising. But the problem there is it seems as soon as it escapes into the services sector, and it's not just goods that rise and fall in price, that's where it's hard to get out.
That's true. And the reason that happens, I think, is because all central banks were late in recognising that inflation was on the move. They let inflation expectations get away. It's now starting to feed into wages. And we're not looking at a wages price spiral, but we're looking at workers naturally trying to compensate themselves for the rise in prices when some businesses can't afford that. So we are looking for only grudging progress in getting inflation back toward the midpoint of the 2 to 3% point here in Australia and to 2% in Europe and the US.
OK, so go to the US because it's further along the track than what Australia is.
I think that's true.
Because it's got its cash rate pretty much at its inflation rate right now.
That's right.
And if you're going to fight inflation, that's where you've got to be. Of course, Australia is light years away from it.
I think that's true. If you look at Australia's trim mean inflation rate at 6.6%, it's higher than most other countries. In the US, it's around about 5%. In Canada, it's about 4.4%. In New Zealand, it's 5.8%. Even in the UK and Europe, their core rates of inflation are less than Australia. So we are behind a little, and that explains, I think, why Philip Lowe surprised markets this week by increasing the policy
OK,
rate.
so you can actually see it here, and this is where the cash rates sit with these major economies, and you can see where their inflation rates sit. Now, you can see, as you point out, Canada, it's pretty much got its inflation lined up. In the United States, they've got it now pretty much lined up. And of course, as you point out, there's going to be an inflation number out of the US this week, and that's a pretty important number, isn't it?
It is a pretty important number. I doubt whether it will show sufficient progress for the Fed to contemplate, say, rate cuts, which is what the market is thinking at the moment, despite just having raised rates. I don't think progress will be sufficient to allow the Fed to contemplate that.
But at some point down the track, the markets have been saying, even here, that late this year, sometime into next year, there are going to be rate cuts coming.
Markets have been saying that for some time. Ever since the Fed embarked upon a 75 basis point rate increase, June last year, markets have been crying recession. Recession, recession, recession. They've been crying wolf about that. Now, that famous parable concludes with the wolf finally showing up, and the recession will show up. But let's not take what markets expect as being, inevitable, because they've been wrong for quite some time. And I don't think they've really understood the complexity of the task that faces the Federal Reserve in getting sticky inflation down and at the same time managing a downturn. I will point out one thing. If you look at the Federal Reserve's forecast, they only forecast 0.5% GDP growth this year. We've already had that.
Yes.
We had that in the first quarter. So the Fed forecasts are consistent with a recession, consistent with a shallow recession.
Yes.
So it's going to take more than that for the Fed to want to cut rates, yet the market's got 100 basis points of rate cuts between now and January next year.
Which seems crazy. And markets also, we should remember, had priced in a 100% chance of the Reserve Bank here doing nothing last month. And of course, then they raised the rates. That meant that the markets were 100% wrong. OK, so then you go to, again, the United States, because this is really important in what happens next. And that is when you see the contagion among the banks right now. It starts with Signature Bank and Silicon Valley Bank. Credit Suisse is a different kettle of fish in Europe, of course, but it gets rescued by USB. Then you've got First Republic, and you've got all the deposit holders there saved by JP Morgan. Now you've got regional banks starting to fall apart this week. You've got Pacific West and others really falling apart. Now, there's a worry here that if you start to have worries about who's next, then liquidity starts to dry up. And that's when you get a real recession.
And you get confidence is, if I'm a depositor in a regional bank, am I going to keep my money there? Probably not. I think.
And how quickly can you move your money these days? You don't have to queue up.
No, exactly. You can go online and do it.
Well, that's what happened with First Republic, $100 billion coming out in a very short space of time.
I think there's a couple of issues here, though. I mean, in the GFC, where we didn't have inflation and central banks could act with alacrity, albeit, probably not sufficiently quickly, but they could act with alacrity. They could take rates to zero. They could do QE. They could do whatever they wanted. Here, where we've got what seems to be if not intractable, certainly a very stubborn inflation problem, that's not an option open to central banks anymore. They've got to try and juggle things differently. So that's one issue. The second issue, as you said, when we have extraordinarily accommodating monetary policy, which was persisted with for far too long, you invite excess. So what we're seeing now is the unwinding of that excess. There's another issue which I think is interesting too, is at around the time of the GFC, there was a number of rules introduced under the Basel Accords and by the G20 involving the net stable funding ratio.
Yes.
They applied to everyone except for one sector. Guess which one that one is? US regional banks.
Regional banks. I didn't have that. Stephen Miller from GSFM, many thanks for your time today.
It's a pleasure, Ross. Thank you.